One night with my father changed my life forever. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever changed. Our days were predictable, our routines were set in stone. My mom passed away in 2016 and I still miss her a lot. My dad was more quiet and withdrawn. My relationship with my family was good, but there was always something distant about my dad, as if he were a part of me that I could never truly understand. After my mother passed away, things changed at home. It was as if we hadn't changed, but my dad and I got along well. But because my mom wasn't around to balance everything, I felt different. There was an odd gap left by her disappearance, and my dad and I had to learn how to live together in the house. I was 16 years old and ready to begin my sophomore year of high school. My father and I were the only people remaining at home after my mother died. I assumed quiet dinners would be simple. On a beautiful Sunday night, it all began. We had been on our own for the majority of the day. My dad was out in the garage fiddling with something, and I was in my room browsing through my phone. He summoned me downstairs when it was time for dinner. He had prepared spaghetti. In the peaceful kitchen, we took a seat to dine. Everything seemed a little too ideal, almost unreal, as the evening sun streamed a gentle golden light through the windows. "How was everything going?" he inquired. She swirled noodles on her fork, breaking the stillness. He nodded, as usual, and we continued to eat in quiet for a few more minutes, despite the fact that there wasn't anything to say. Occasionally, I could feel her gaze on me, as though she was going to speak but was holding back. I stared at him and was taken aback when he put down his fork and leaned back in his chair, saying, "It's nice to talk to you more these days." Of course, she was correct. I became more interested in school and my friends as I grew older. Unlike when we were youngsters working on projects together or going fishing on the weekends, I spent a lot of time with my dad. Yes, I believe I mentioned that things are hectic because of high school and everything else while grinning a little. He also grinned, but I couldn't quite make out what was behind his eyes. He responded softly, "I understand, but it's important to stay in touch." Once more, I had the impression that there was more to what he was saying than first appeared, but at the time, I didn't give it much thought. I began to clean the plates after we had completed our supper. "We haven't done that in a long time, so why don't we watch a movie or something?" My dad answered, "I'll handle it." It seemed a little weird, but I agreed. I wasn't sure what had prompted this sudden effort, and we hadn't spent much time together recently, but I wasn't going to dispute. After settling into the living room, we watched an old action movie on the flickering television as my dad changed the stations. I was distracted, my mind wandering, and my father was seated closer to me than normal on the couch. As the movie went on, I saw his arm leaning slightly behind the couch, and I moved a little because it felt weird. However, I reminded myself that it was nothing because it was only my dad. But as the evening wore on, the mood of the room started to shift. My father's eyes were always on me when I glanced at him, and for reasons I couldn't quite fathom, he watched me with a kind of intensity that made my pulse race. But then his hand moved. At first, it was subtle, as if it had accidentally touched my shoulder, but it lingered a little too long. His fingers lightly scraped my skin, my breath caught in my throat, and I shifted uneasily, but I said nothing. A few more minutes went by, and I could feel the tension between us growing. I tried to concentrate on the movie, but I was unable to do so because my mind was racing and I couldn't ignore the sensation of his hand on my shoulder, his thumb nearly absent. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and he didn't move at first, but then leaned slightly. His breath warmed my ear. "What happened?" I froze, my heart was pounding, there was something in his voice, something light yet heavy. I was attempting to ascertain if I was exaggerating or whether something was actually occurring. As I turned back, I tried to make sense of what was going on and wondered if I was exaggerating or if anything was actually occurring. I opened my mouth, but the words would not come. My skin tingled and I couldn't help but quiver as my father's hand moved gently down my arm, his fingers warm and purposeful. I wanted to back off and say something, but I just stood there. He said, "It's okay," in a voice that was almost heard above the television. I no longer felt that way, even if we were only spending time together. I sprang to my feet abruptly, my heart pounding. I blurted out, "I think I'm going to bed," in a shaky voice. For a minute, my dad's expression was inscrutable as he glanced at me. I was expecting him to say something, but all he did was shake his head. His gaze followed me out of the room. "Good night," he muttered quietly. My heart was racing in my ears as I rushed up the stairs. That night, I was unable to get much sleep, so I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling while my mind was racing. The memory of his touch sent chills down my spine, despite my best efforts to tell myself that I was dreaming and that everything was in my brain. That night, something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. The following day, I was unsure of how to respond to him and how to pretend that nothing had happened. However, I felt in my heart that this was only the beginning. There was stillness in the morning following that odd, stressful night. I lingered in my room longer than normal in the hopes of avoiding an awkward breakfast with my father, but ultimately hunger got the better of me and I realized I couldn't hide indefinitely. I inhaled deeply before heading downstairs. Even though the kitchen was flooded with sunlight, the atmosphere was still heavy with recollections of the night before. For a brief while, the room was empty, but I expected to find my father seated at the table, drinking his coffee and reading the news as usual. I experienced a sense of relief. I wouldn't have to deal with him if he had left for the day. However, my stomach turned when I heard footsteps in the corridor when I was making myself a bowl of cereal. After taking a shower and getting dressed, my father came into the kitchen as like nothing had happened that morning. He smiled slightly at me, assuming his typical kind and composed manner. I held to my cereal as he hurriedly took a seat at the table, unwilling to look him in the eye or recall the insanity of the night before. I hoped he wouldn't say anything, but I could feel him observing me. Naturally, things didn't work out that way. My father replied, "You looked a bit tense last night," in a calm but unmistakably sharp voice. With my spoon hovering above my bowl, I took a deep gulp. He nodded, but I could see incredulity in his eyes as he said, "Yeah, I was just tired." Nothing. His eyes never left my face as he sipped his coffee. Similar to the previous evening, I saw tension growing between us. I gripped to my cereal as I hastily sat down at the table, unwilling to look at anybody or recall the insanity of the night before. I hoped he wouldn't say anything, but I could feel him observing me. Naturally, things didn't work out that way. My father replied, "You looked a bit tense last night," in a calm but unmistakably sharp voice. With my spoon hovering above my bowl, I took a deep gulp. He nodded, but I could see incredulity in his eyes as he said, "Yeah, I was just tired." Nothing. His eyes never left my face as he sipped his coffee. Similar to the previous evening, I saw tension growing between us. I gripped to my cereal as I hastily sat down at the table, unwilling to look at anybody or recall the insanity of the night before. My dad sat across from me and poured himself a cup of coffee. I bowed my head in the hopes that he wouldn't speak, even though I could feel him observing me. Naturally, though, things didn't work out that way. My father added, "You seemed a bit tense last night," in a calm but unmistakably sharp voice. With my spoon hovering above my bowl, I took a deep gulp. He nodded, but I could see incredulity in his eyes as he said, "Yeah, I was just tired, nothing more." His eyes never left my face as he sipped his coffee. Like the previous evening, I sensed tension between us. "You know, we don't have to make this awkward." My father suddenly put down the glass in his hand, leaned slightly forward, and said, "We should be able to talk about everything." I looked up at him, and the way he said it, the softness in his voice, made my heart race. This wasn't a suggestion, it was almost a challenge. "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but my nerves were fraying. "But no, I mean, nothing really happened, did it?" My dad leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. "It's up to you," he said quietly. "If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to, but if there's something on your mind." Did he know what he was doing? Was he testing me to see how far he could push this unspoken boundary between us, or was I the one reading too much into everything? I don't know what to say. I admitted that my voice barely surpassed a whisper. He lightly brushed his hand against mine. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything, you're not ready. I just want you to feel comfortable with me." His touch sent a tremor through me, and I quickly pulled my hand away. I stood up from the table. "I'm going outside for a bit," I said. I took my phone from the counter. My father didn't stop me, he just nodded, and as I hurried out the door, he watched me. As soon as I stepped outside, a cool breeze hit my face, and I let out a shaky breath without realizing it. My thoughts were in turmoil, my emotions were in turmoil. I was overreacting, thinking all of this was in my head, but deep down I knew it wasn't right. Something was happening, and I didn't know how to deal with it. For a while, I wandered aimlessly through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. I needed to clear my mind to figure out how to cope with this strange new dynamic. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory of his touch and words wouldn't leave my mind. When I returned home, it was afternoon, the sun had begun to set, and long shadows were cast over the house. Before entering, I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I was ready to face my father again, but I couldn't. When I entered the house, the first thing I noticed was the sound of the television in the living room. My father was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, just like the previous night. When he saw me, he looked up and, with a small smile, asked if I was feeling better. His voice was calm, but something was off. "Yes," I lied. I walked past the living room and headed for the stairs. "I just needed to clear my head." "Okay," he said, his eyes following me as I climbed the stairs. Then he said, "Let me know if you want to talk." I didn't respond. I hurried to my room and closed the door. My heart was racing in my chest, my mind was racing with a whirlwind of emotions that I didn't know how to handle that night. I stayed in my room, avoiding my father as much as possible. I could hear him walking around downstairs, watching television, and eventually going to bed, but I didn't leave my room. The next few days went by the same way. I kept my distance, avoided long conversations, and tried to keep everything as normal as possible, but every time I saw my dad, I could feel the tension between us increasing, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a weight we both carried, and then one evening it was Friday night and my mom was still away on her trip. I had been in my room all day, trying to distract myself by watching television and scrolling through my phone, but the tension in the house was starting to get to me. Hoping it would help clear my mind, I decided to go downstairs for some fresh air. When I entered the living room, my dad was sitting on the couch with a beer in hand. He looked up when he saw me, and I immediately sensed something was different. There was a look in his eyes, something darker than I had ever seen before. "Hey," he said, his voice low, "come sit with me for a bit." I hesitated, my heart was racing, there was something in his voice, a chill ran down my spine at his gaze. "I'm fine," I said, quickly turning towards the door. "I just needed some fresh air." But before I could leave, my father stood up, walking towards me with silent and deliberate steps. My heart raced and I recoiled. Instinctively, my pulse raced in my ears. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't stop, he kept walking towards me, his eyes locked onto mine. The room suddenly felt very small, very close, and then he stopped right in front of me, reaching out to touch my arm. His fingers were warm against my skin. "You don't need to be afraid," he whispered, his voice soft yet firm. "It's just us here, there's no one else." These words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and in that moment, I realized that this was not just in my head, it was real, and there was no turning back. I leaned my back against the door, my pulse had frozen. The room was very quiet, the air was very dense, my father's hand was still on my arm, his fingers were pressing a bit harder than they should have, his touch created a wave of confusion and fear inside me, it made me nauseous. "You don't need to be afraid, Dad," he repeated. This time his voice was even softer, as if he was trying to soothe me, but the way he said it only heightened the tension, igniting the panic in my chest even more. I'm not lying, my voice barely rose above a whisper, but we both knew it wasn't right. My father's eyes stayed on mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I was standing on the edge of something, and I didn't know whether I would fall or pull back to a safe place. "You don't have to pretend," he said, his fingers sliding down my arm in a way that made my skin tingle. "I know how you feel." I took a step back, my heart was racing, and my mind was spinning with thousands of different thoughts, none of which made sense. I started, but the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what was happening when I couldn't even understand it myself? He opened the distance between us again, and this time I couldn't move. His hand reached out, gently brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers grazed my cheek. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "just let it happen." I felt trapped in some kind of nightmare. It was as if everything was moving both very fast and very slow at the same time. My legs were frozen, every part of me was screaming to get out of the room, to run, to stand there and let it happen, but my body refused to move. "Dad, please," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." His hand fell to his side, but he didn't pull away, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, something unfamiliar. "I know it felt confusing," he said softly, "but not wrong. You will understand this soon." My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe, as if the walls were closing in around me, trapping me in this moment with no way out. "I am your father," he continued, his voice calm and soothing. "I have always been here for you, and I will always be here." I needed to step outside to put some distance between us. With everything spiraling out of control, I couldn't stay in this room with him. "I need to get some fresh air." As I was backing towards the door, I said I needed to go. My father didn't try to stop me this time, he just stood there and watched me with the same unreadable gaze. His eyes were following my every move. I turned and left. As I hurried down the corridor, my breath was trembling. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face. I took a deep breath to calm myself, but it didn't work. My hands were trembling. My heart was still pounding with fear. I couldn't understand what had just happened, what had happened to my father. A part of me wanted to believe that I had misunderstood, that I had overreacted, but his gaze, his touch were not products of my imagination. My emotions were a mess. I didn't know where to go or who to talk to. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me, and even if they did, what would it mean? It wasn't as if my father hadn't done anything yet, but I knew it was a lie. He had done something. He had crossed a line, and even if he hadn't, I felt like the ground beneath me was slipping away in an undeniable way. The worst part was that I didn't know how to prevent it from happening again. When I returned home, the house was silent. I hesitated at the front door, my hand resting on the doorknob, unsure if I was ready to go inside. But where else could I go? This was my home, and there was nowhere else to run. This was my home, and there was nowhere else to run. When I finally went inside, the lights were off, and I heard nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. The living room was empty. As I climbed the stairs, my stomach churned with anxiety. The house felt different now, and no matter how much I wanted everything to be the same, I knew it wouldn't be possible. When I reached my room, everything had changed. I gently closed the door behind me, locked it as a precaution, and leaned my head against it. I didn't know what to do next. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and I didn't know how to handle it. I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that everything was over, that I could just go to sleep and forget what had happened, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end, more was coming, and worst of all, I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to handle it. The next morning, when I woke up, I felt a heaviness on my chest as if there was a weight pressing down on me, and the events of the previous night were swirling in my mind like a dark cloud. I knew I couldn't escape it any longer, even if it terrified me. I had to confront what had happened between my father and me. I stayed in my room as long as I could, trying to gather my thoughts, but the tension in the house was suffocating. As I descended with fear, each step felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to confront. When I arrived there, the kitchen was empty, but I could hear the faint sound of the television coming from the living room. He was waiting for me, the air was filled with unspoken tension, and I could feel my heart racing as I approached him. "He didn't look at me this morning," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge I couldn't ignore. I barely managed to respond to him this morning. I paused for a moment, not knowing what to do. I couldn't continue acting like nothing was wrong, but I didn't know how to start this conversation. How could I talk about something like this with my father? Finally, I took a deep breath and sat across from him, saying, "We need to talk." My voice was slightly trembling. My father looked at me, then his eyes became serious, but there was a vibration of something. Another thing, something darker, something that twisted my stomach with worry. "Do you know what I said last night? What happened?" For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, leaned back on the couch, and rubbed his face. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I think you're making this into something bigger than it is." A wave of anger and confusion crashed over me, feeling like it was going to swallow me whole. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You touched me, Dad." I looked at him, my heart pounding, and I said, "I didn't feel like that for the first time," seeing something break in his calm exterior. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw guilt flash across his face, but then he shook his head. "You're overreacting," he said, his expression hardening. "You're confused." His voice was firmer now. "I'm your father. You said something." His jaw tightened, and he looked away, focusing his gaze on the television as if that would somehow erase this conversation. "I would never hurt you." I felt my hands trembling in my lap, a mix of fear and disappointment bubbling inside me. "This isn't about hurting me," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about crossing a line." There it was, the truth hanging between us, heavy and raw. I couldn't take it back. Despite feeling like my world was collapsing, I had to hold on. Even though it felt like my world was collapsing, I had to endure. My father got up and started pacing the room with restless energy. "This is very silly. You're my son." He changed everything. I said, "I'm not a child anymore," my voice stabilized. "I know what's happening." My father stopped pacing, his eyes locked onto mine for a long time. He said nothing. I could see the battle within him, the silence stretched on, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the tension in the room had become almost suffocating, and finally, he spoke. He took a long breath, his shoulders slumped, as if he had finally stopped pretending. "I didn't want this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "Then why did it happen?" He sat back down on the couch, rubbing his hands together angrily. "I don't know," he said, his voice sounding like a small defeat. "I think I was alone. Your mother left so often and you grew up so fast. I don't know. It got out of control." The confession hit me like a punch in the stomach. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but it was true, and now that it's out, there's no going back. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "I messed up." Everything was lifted. I sat there and looked at him, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside me, anger, sadness, fear, and confusion. I didn't know what to say. How could I? There was no easy way to fix what had happened between us, no simple word that could erase everything. "We need help," I finally said, my voice trembling. "We can't ignore this." My father nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes vacant. "I know," he whispered, "I'll find a way, I'll fix this," but I wasn't sure he could, and I wasn't sure anyone could. When I suggested that my father see a psychologist, he finally agreed. It was difficult, in fact, it was one of the most difficult things I have ever gone through, but gradually things began to change, we began to heal, and my father moved out of the house for a while. During this time, I tried to find the strength to understand the complex emotions I was carrying, and I wasn't sure if I would be able to forgive him completely or if things would return to normal. Eventually, I managed to move on.